President Trump's second term started with a flurry of activity designed, as they say, to flood the zone, with so many actions that challenged the parameters of what was supposed to be in the president's power that it was hard for anyone to keep track. Which, of course, was exactly the point of doing it that way. The aim was to expand the president's power by pushing all of these test cases, seeing where the system caved and where it pushed back. Because with the administration prepared to use every bit of power that it had in a highly punitive way, rather a lot of it seemed to cave very quickly. Not even 100 days in yet, and the difference between a future for America that is full-on autocracy and one where an aberrant administration is barely but successfully contained is how many and how well institutions are able to resist that overreach. Now, the universities have discovered this. Firstly, that Trump's approach started by trying to isolate and pick them off one by one. In the early interactions between the administration and Columbia University, Trump threatened to withdraw $400 million in federal grants unless the university agreed to toughen its policies around student protests and anti-Semitism and campus security. Also to appoint a new senior vice provost with a focus on Middle East studies, and to appoint new faculty with the responsibility of excellence in that area. Described as putting the department in academic receivership. Sort of grey area stuff, all can sort of be justified as reasonable things that should happen. Somewhat questionable whether the federal government should be insisting on it with Menace's mind. But okay, as we know, Columbia agreed to that a month ago as this video is being shot. But if they thought that would mean the funding would now be made available, well, they'd misjudged just how much the Trump team wants to push and push to get more and more whenever they found that they had leverage over somebody. So, a couple of weeks later, the Wall Street Journal reported that the administration had more demands, that the university be placed under a consent decree, where federal judges would oversee and enforce the reforms for a number of years. The exact details of what would be required under the decree are not clear, but could potentially be far-reaching. It would be an extraordinary ceding of independence by the university to the judiciary in decision-making on its own policies. Effectively, it would be surrender of the institution to the ongoing preferences of the federal government. Then it moved to Harvard, and here is where we discovered that some of the institutions, faced with the most egregious demands, are still capable of fighting back. Harvard had its mea culpa moment after the university's then-president Claudine Gay was pummeled in testimony to the House Education Committee in December 23, when she equivocated over agreeing that calls for genocide of Jewish people constituted bullying and harassment. So the cause of combating anti-Semitism was an obvious convenient starting point when the Trump administration turned to Harvard. So it demanded Harvard get a third party to audit multiple programs and departments for evidence of anti-Semitism and bias. And on that side, there were what were described as productive, quiet discussions between the university and the administration that seemed to be making progress. Until suddenly, out of the blue, it was hit with a letter making much more far-reaching and intrusive demands. An end to all diversity, equity and inclusion programs, changes to hiring practices, crackdowns on student protests and student groups and clubs. The university was to screen foreign student applicants for anyone who could be deemed to be, quote, hostile to the American values and institutions, and also submit to third-party screening to audit university departments for viewpoint diversity, which you might think was a self-contradiction, screening out international students who have one set of beliefs, while demanding your student body have a mix of beliefs. That is, unless you realise that the phrase viewpoint diversity doesn't really mean diversity as the common dictionary definition would have it. It means a large enough percentage, exact number to be made up as we go along, of people who think like us, unlike the left-leaning liberal types that you usually, according to us, fill your courses with. There have been, of course, some fairly valid criticisms of the elite universities for being too ideologically focused, too hostile to conservative points of view. This, however, skates past the opportunities to look at how you can constructively address such problems, and it just goes straight for state control of who's allowed to do what. If a foreign applicant thinks that Trump is an idiot, and believe me, quite a lot of them do, because it's a very common viewpoint outside of the United States, does that alone make them, quote, hostile to American values? The attitudes of some US border guards seems to suggest that at least some people would think so. And of course that's reinforced by the numbers of students we've already seen who have had their visas cancelled because of the free expression of their views. What used to be known as free speech, but is now to be known as support for terrorism and hostility to the values of the United States. Values which used to include free speech. Anyway, Harvard took one look at this letter with its expansive list of demands and concluded that it had no choice but to tell Trump to go take a hike, and then to contest the inevitable attempt to withhold funds. The current Harvard president, Mallen Baker, said that what was being asked, quote, violates Harvard's First Amendment rights and exceeds the statutory limits of the government's authority under Title VI, and it threatens our values as a private institution devoted to the pursuit, production, and dissemination of knowledge. No government, regardless of which party is in power, should dictate what private universities can teach, whom they can admit and hire, and which areas of study and inquiry they can pursue. They had seen what Columbia did and decided that appeasement doesn't seem to work, a lesson that the human race has learned famously before, it must be said. Trump promptly froze funding to Harvard of $2.2 billion. He's also muttering about removing its tax-exempt status. It's one of the issues where his team believe that they have an advantage, because many people see the elite universities as being somewhat out of touch and in need of reform, so going up against them is a win. And if Democrats line up alongside the universities, then that's good as well, because it helps in being able to dismiss them as siding with the elites. But it's the process of interference that is at stake. As always, the extreme partisans, and it's true of both sides, but only one side is in action here, they don't care so much about the process, so long as the outcome is what they want. Yes, both parties care a lot about free speech when they're in opposition. When they're in government, well, not so much. And that is a dynamic you can see all over the world in some form, to be fair. Lawrence Summers, former Harvard president, told CNN why he believed Harvard should fight. Universities are in need of a great deal of reform, and it's come too slowly. But that's not a reason why the government can entirely suspend the law and make up self-serving political demands and impose them on universities. Now, of course, President Trump tweeted his outrage. Harvard is a joke. Teaches hate and stupidity, he said. Both highly valued skills in modern America, so what are you complaining about? Very soon after Harvard signalled its stand, Columbia University joined in rejecting the new demands that had been made and reversing its initial capitulation. Sometimes the first one to stand up will prompt the others to follow. This tactic of isolating individual targets, bullying them one by one into an ongoing subservience, is something that is being brought to bear against other institutions as well. So, for instance, major law firms, some of which have found themselves specifically named in Trump's executive orders. Their crime, It's not a crime at all. They represented someone against Trump in one of his cases, or something similar where the law is happening the way it's meant to happen. They were encouraged to make deals with the administration, which seemed relatively harmless, like they should provide significant value services pro bono for uncontroversial causes that are chosen by Trump. Harold Honju Ko, Yale professor of international law, told the New York Times they thought they had made one-shot deals, which they would fulfill. But the administration seems to think that they have subjected these firms to indentured servitude. So there came new demands that the firms defend the coal industry, negotiate trade deals for the government, and represent Trump and his favoured friends in various legal proceedings they all seem to be mired in. In an op-ed for the New York Times, Thomas Edsall quoted Iveta Silova talking about how, when Hitler first took office in 1933, his regime quickly purged academic institutions of various ideas and opponents. And it worked, she said, because of, quote, the eagerness of many academic leaders to comply, justify, and normalise the new order. Each decision, each erased name, each revised syllabus, each closed programme and department was framed as necessary, even patriotic. Within a few years, German universities no longer served knowledge, they served power. We've already seen that within the government's own activity. Climate scientists have seen their programs shut down. Various health research has been vetted and edited. For example, one top NIH scientist specialising in nutrition resigned a week or so ago, saying, I experienced censorship in the reporting of our research because of agency concerns it did not appear to fully support preconceived narratives of my agency's leadership about ultra-processed food addiction. So yes, the institution's being required to serve power and not knowledge. Seems like a very clear line you have to choose to step across. And bear this in mind when Trump says that his dispute with Harvard is over the suggestion that it, quote, keeps pushing political, ideological and terrorist-inspired / supporting sickness. Those are words that can be casually applied to any subject where the science doesn't fit what the administration wants you to believe, because they use words without meaning. As well as those courses where there are political viewpoints that are opposite to what Trump may believe, indeed what you and I might believe, but people should still know about them in an educated society. This isn't how it's rationalised by those who don't tweet in all caps, of course. One White House education source told the UK's Telegraph, we're ending cancel culture and discriminatory hiring practices under the false notion of equality. It's not about dictating to universities what they should teach, and we're not taking away anybody's freedom. Well, it's hard to square that, though, with Trump's all-cap words, the letter of what's being demanded, the way that scientists are being censored, and the way that demands that are met are then followed by more extreme demands. And then there are some academics who would support the genuine push for more intellectual diversity in universities, who are on Trump's side in that sense in spirit, who nevertheless are not taken in practice. So, for instance, Harvard professor Greg Mankey, a former advisor to George W. Bush, who said this, some of their arguments I have sympathy for, but the White House trying to exercise more power is dangerous, and to me, a lot of what Donald Trump is doing is trying to keep himself at the centre of attention. I believe in limited government, and what the Trump administration is doing is anything but that. Not all American institutions are doing their job in the face of the Trump bullying approach, however. Both branches of Congress have seen many of the areas that are reserved for them taken instead by the president, casually citing bogus emergencies as a flimsy justification. And they've so far just watched without complaint. As Senator Lisa Murkowski said, "We are all afraid. We're in a time and place where, I don't know, I certainly have not. I have not been here before. And I'll tell you, I'm oftentimes very anxious myself about using my voice because retaliation is real." She has been one of a very few prepared to criticise the administration, of course, and she had to beat a Trump-backed challenger in a primary in 2022 as a result, which is exactly the sort of retribution her colleagues fear the most, now that Elon Musk's money seems to be in endless supply for such challenges. The other co-equal branch of government, the Supreme Court, may well end up being the most important bulwark against the creeping authoritarianism. Now, it is, of course, heavily conservative in its balance, 6-3. But unlike Trump's picks for his cabinet members, where he selected slavish loyalty over even the barest of competence, the Supreme Court justices do still come from an era where the law matters, and while they may be inclined to interpret it willfully, they are unlikely to lightly agree to just break it. So, for instance, the Supreme Court this weekend just gone responded unambiguously against the administration in response to an emergency request to prevent the removal of Venezuelan migrants. The government is directed not to remove any member of the putative class of detainees from the United States until further order of this court. Unambiguous, but then, as we know, it has to be, because ambiguity in wording can be the difference between the administration having to bring back someone who was wrongfully accidentally deported and them claiming not to have to do a single thing. Even judges appointed by Trump himself, Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett, have shown that while they may have been indulgent in areas that were ambiguous, such as the degree of liability for actions taken as president, there is a line they are not inclined to cross. It's not as though this administration is anything other than blatant in its disregard for that particular line. It just marches over it with a look on its face that says, "Stop me if you dare." And it has slated the latest decision, arguing that if America is going to deport hundreds of people at a time, quote, "America cannot give everyone a trial." Given that hundreds of Venezuelan men are not just being deported, but are being sent to what looks like one of the worst gulags in history, it's not exactly reflective of those American values that everyone's supposed to agree with when they come in to study there, for instance. At least not the one that says everyone should have the level of due process appropriate. Now look, if you're just deporting someone who entered the country illegally, it's a relatively light amount of due process required. To confirm the person's identity and their status really is what you believe it to be. But if you're sending them to the worst prison in the world, arguably, then yes, not enough to say that you think that they're a gang member because they have a tattoo or something. But the point is that America's institutions are meant to protect it from the rise of a monarch or a dictator. We've seen from first contact that the exercise of brutal direct power has led many of those institutions to instinctively retreat, to keep their heads down, to comply with initial requests and hope that means that they will be left alone. It is now sinking in that that is not going to be the process. So we're about to find out how well can America's system stand to a determined assault by the executive branch seeking to reduce everyone else to vassal status. And it matters because every single step that is granted will be followed by the next step and the next step after that. The country has to define where it's going to draw that line and then whether it has the willpower to hold that line.